Hello there everybody, and welcome to day 2 of Nodevember, where today we're doing Junkyard. By the way, I know that space Junkyard is one prompt to be done over 2 days, but I'm just splitting the prompts, I don't give a fuck. Today we are making these dancing cans, which you might think, oh, what's the big deal? You know, you just take a can, do a rigid body or a soft body simulation and all this. But no, these cans deforming and being crushed, all done with math and geometry nodes procedurally. So that's what we're going to do. Only other note for today, so you know this isn't the Junkyard theme because it's a can being crushed. Only other note for today is I have a bit of a strep throat, sore throat, one of these, and I have a glass of hot water. I don't know if you can see, but it's steaming. And I will be sipping that every once in a while. So if I lose my voice, that is why. Okay, so we're making cans compress and all this, and I think for this tutorial we're just going to make like a singular, let's show this, a singular can that goes up and down and all this, and then you just copy it and make 5 of them. This is complicated because we somehow need to do a deformation that really looks like a can being crushed, and it's all procedural and all this. Either way, let's begin. I feel like I've gone long enough. As always, delete everything, add in a cube, and go to geometry nodes and add in a geonodes thing, and delete this so that we have a clean slate where everything we do is nodes. If we want a can being compressed, the question is, 1, how do you make a can, and 2, how do you compress it? Making the can is pretty simple. As you'd imagine, you start with a cylinder. That is the primitive that is the closest, so I'm going to start off with the cylinder. I'm going to say, make it 3 units tall, have it have more geometry, and I'm also going to place it, and you'll see why in a second, but I'm going to place it so that it's sitting on the XY plane instead of down here. So since this is 3 units tall, I know that halfway is 1.5, and that's how much I need to bring it up by. So on the Z, by 1.5, I'm going to transform it. The reason, by the way, that I'm putting it on the ground plane is I want to compress it, which ends up looking like scaling towards z equals 0. So that just makes the math easy instead of having this negative z stuff. Okay, so we have a can. It doesn't really look like a can. I think one thing we can do is add ridges to this. Another thing we can do is we can kind of inset the top here. Both things that are easy to do with modeling, but with procedural modeling, a little bit more tricky. Starting off with these ridges, if you think about it, it's kind of like a sine, so it's going to be kind of like a corrugated metal sheet in a sense. If you think about it, it's kind of like a sine wave. So if we can recast the position, again, anytime we change the position, we use a set position node. If we can recast this as we go up on the z-axis to kind of scale radially outward by a sine wave, then we've done it, okay? So for this, we actually need more geometry. So if I go into wireframe, you see we don't have any bands going across. So of course we can't deform it. I'm going to add some side segments. And let's go with 40 for now. We could add more later. So what I want to do is I want to offset the position. I want to offset the position. There's a couple ways to do this. By the normal, which is to say kind of expand outwards, but I only want to do this for the side, so I'm going to use that as the selection. It doesn't seem to like that. Top, bottom, side. Interesting. I guess what we can do is we can do a inverse selection where we don't have top and bottom, I guess. So what we can do is do a subtract. Interesting problem I didn't expect to encounter. So we take everything, which is to say 1, we subtract away the top, we take this and we subtract away the bottom, and that just gives us the side, right? So if we take our normal now, so I know it got a bit confusing, if we take this normal and scale it, you can see it's expanding or extruding radially outwards only on the side. Which looks like this from a solid view. And maybe another thing to do is you can see that we might keep it, but you see there's a bit of a tilt here. If you wanted to fix this, I think we can do a domain interpolation. And we set this to vector. And instead of point, we have this at face corner, or face, or one of these. Edge seems to kind of correct it. Either way, You can see how there's a bit of a difference between these two. You can decide what you want. Basically, though, I want to scale this outwards, where the factor is a sine wave that oscillates as we go upwards on the z-axis, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the z component of the position. So separate x, y, z, position. So we're taking the z component. So you can see as we go upwards, it extrudes. Again, nice thing about putting this on the ground plane is we know we're going from 0, z equals 0, up to z equals 3. So what I want to do is I want to take this and send it through a sine wave so that we get a oscillation. And we're only going to get one period, right? To get more oscillations, I'm going to multiply this by a bigger number. And you can see we get something like this. Not exactly what we want because it's scaling between -1 and 1. So we're just going to map range this boy. So take -1 to 1 and send it to like 0 to 0.1, right? So it's either going to scale by 0, which is to say keep the original shape, or it's just going to add 10% on the normal. And you can see this creates the ridges. Again, we have this sine wave going up the z-axis. We can control the period, which is the number of ridges. And yeah. So I think I'm just going to pick parameters that look pretty good. So something like this, maybe 25 ridges, and let's add some more geometry so it's a bit cleaner. Maybe 20 ridges. There we go. So we have something that looks a lot more like a can now. Another thing I'm going to do, by the way, if we look at the geometry, is we have all these side segments, but we don't have any top and bottom segments. Does the cylinder let us do this? It does. We could do fill segments. So we could do this, and then I want to kind of do a divot here, like an extrusion, so it looks like a can, like it has a lip. I'm trying to think about the best way to do this. We could do it a bit sloppy. We could keep this at 1, and then what we could try to do, let's see if this works, is we can do an extrude mesh, not individual, and only extrude it where we're at the top. So let's see what that looks like. So you can see we're extruding now, based off the normal, only on the top selection. So what I'm thinking is, let's extrude by 0. We do something slightly negative so we get a lip, and then we can scale it. So this is kind of like a fancy inset. So I'm going to scale the top by some little amount. And you can see now we're getting a bit of a lip. Maybe I'll do it by 0 so that we actually get an extra band here, and then extrude again from the top and make this one negative. You know, it doesn't really matter how you do this. It is just a bit of a pain to model this procedurally. To kind of smooth this out a bit, I'm going to use a subdivision surface right there. You can see the main issue with subdivision surface is we have a pole here, and that's going to create some weird geometry. So let's do one more extrusion cycle. So let's see the mesh here. I'm going to extrude by 0, only on the top selection, and I'm going to scale elements. So I'm just doing an inset, basically. As you can see, I'm adding another loop. What this effectively does now is it smooths out our subdivision surface effect, right? If we didn't have this last section, we'd have this pole. So I'm pretty happy with that. That kind of looks like a can. We can also mess with the edge crease to say, oh, how sharp should this be? So we could do something like that, so it still looks kind of hard surface and not too bendy. And I think I like the look of that. Okay, so we have our can. The next question is, how do we compress it? There are two things that I found are part of compression. One is kind of distorting this, so it's kind of like broken and some parts are going outwards and inwards and all this. Another part is it needs to squish downwards, which you might think, oh, scale this on the z-axis, right? So you might think, oh, transform this and scale on z to kind of do that. But that's not how cans actually compress. There's some areas where they compress a lot and some where they compress a little, almost like a pressure wave going through a spring. So while scaling on the z-axis kind of feels like the right move, what we need to do is create a custom function that compresses and stuff like this. So I say we start off with the compression, because I think that's a bit more interesting. So anytime we change the position of something, we're going to use a set position. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the position as the position, so nothing's changed. And I think what we can do is we can separate by XYZ and then combine by XYZ. So again, nothing's happened. I'm just saying take the position, split it, combine it, and cast it. But I'm going to take the Z and manipulate it, right? So if I was to, simple example, if I was to add in a math node, we can move this up or whatever. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a custom Z. So let's see, we know our can goes from 0 to 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a map range. We could just do a math division. So I want to cast 0 to 3 to 0 to 1, so it's nice and usable. So now our Z is going from 0 to 1. And the fancy trick is I'm going to use an RGB curves. So if I was to put this in right now, it's going to, if we set it to the color, it's going to basically just compress it depending on the height, right? So it was 0 to 3, now it's 0 to 1. But I think the interesting thing is we could do a custom shape. So we could have it go like this, and then kind of go up in these steps. And what this ends up looking like is there's like more compression in some areas and less in others. So I'm going to take this and then I'm going to stretch it back out. See what that looks like? Yeah, that seems like it is a bit harsh. But you can see how we're getting more like custom compression and all this. So I'm just going to modify this a little, smooth it out. And you can see now we're getting like more pressure here, and it doesn't look so uniform. I guess we want these diagonal lines that change slope. So something like that looks much more custom than something like this, right? And you could like play around with this and change it and all this. And this is just going to be a stretching factor, so I'm going to say, oh, I only want it to go by like 1.5. What we have now is if we mix this with the original position, so I'm just going to flip between the two. What we have, oh, that was an interesting effect, that was almost its own compression. But what we have is we are taking the can from max height with these nice even ridges, and we're compressing it in a way that's not uniform, is the main idea. And I'm adding this mix because we want to be able to animate between these two states. By the way, let me save this. Blend file is going to be available on Patreon and also on Gumroad, I believe. So I'm going to call this Nodevember 2 can. And now the next step is after this is compressed, we want to distort it. So I'm going to do another set position anytime we want to change the position. I'm going to offset, use our normal technique of a noise texture. Again, if you don't remember, a noise texture will always kind of slide everything to the 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 vector. The way you fix this is you just subtract by 0.5. What I mean is now that I include this and don't include this, it's more of a centered effect, whereas before it kind of nudges it to the side. So we're going to offset it, the correction term, and then I'm also going to scale it. And you can see now we're controlling how much this can is doing it. Looks weird. Let's bring down the scale so there's kind of more low resolution detail. And then speaking of detail, I'm going to bring up the detail, bring down the roughness so it's more of a big waves of deformation instead of this like very fine deformation. So something like this. Bit of distortion. And the nice thing about this is if you don't like the result, you can always go to 4 dimensions and just change the compression. So I want it to be a bit more extreme. Something like that. Again, we can always play with the height of this. And something I'm noticing, by the way, is as we stretch this up and down, these waves that we made, the ridges don't really map with it. Or sorry, the noise doesn't really map with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually capture the position. So right now it's just using position as the thing, and it almost looks weird. It looks like the noise is staying still and all this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to capture an attribute, set this to vector. I'm going to capture the position and use this as our coordinate system. The difference here now is it stretches with it, as you can see. Well, we can fix the deformation, but right now I also want to focus on this section right here, where we clearly have some issues. Is this because of the subdivision surface? Kind of. What we can do, I guess we can just do another round of like insetting, so let's do that. Or what happens if we add some fill segments? That smooths it out too. So I'm just trying to get rid of the pull. So let's see what this looks like. I'm going to get rid of our this. I also want to have a slider to control the amount of deformation. So I'm going to use another mix RGB, mix it with position. So when it's set to 1, we have none. When it's set to 0, we have our deformation. What is going on here? Oh, because this is an offset. So we want to offset by 0, actually. There we go. This still looks good, even with the more fill segments. Just in case we have some topology errors, I'm just going to run a merge by distance. I don't know if this is going to be an issue or not. I'm just going to run it anyways. I guess we can see if more or less geometry was cut off. Either way, what I'm going to do at this point is we have this, the deformation step, and this, the compression step, and I want to make these both dependent on a single number. So I'm going to use this as our factor. As 0 goes to 1, we get this nice compression. And the question is, can we make this look a bit better? And I think the answer is yes. So I'm going to bring down the scale even more. Now it kind of looks like a compressed can. Maybe just add a bit of detail. Yeah, I like the look of that. That looks pretty good. So we now have this slider that lets us go from one to the other. I'm going to cast this to time. So as the frames progress, and now let me use some of that water I was talking about, which is too hot. Oh, that actually really helped. Now as we go over with time, you can see our compression changes. I'm going to map it so it goes the other direction. So map range 0 to 1, 1 to 0. So as we play, our can compresses, and I think something that would make this look better, so let's say it only takes like 1/3 of a second, is usually cans compress in like steps, like it's not a smooth process. So I'm going to set this to stepped linear, which is going to make this into 4 steps. And I think that looks pretty good, honestly. Okay. I think final thing is giving this thing a material and adding the eyes and all this. And by the way, once I did the dancing animation, I just kind of used this, instead of time, I used this and animated whether or not it's compressed based on the music. Let's make a material. So all of this is our can generation and our compression. Let's apply a material. And that material could just be a metal reflective thing. But I guess we also need to have the eye sockets, which is not obvious how to do. Because I'm going to do it in material, I'm not going to boolean out eye sockets. So for the material, which we can call can, what we see is when we go to the render tab, these are now linked, right? I changed the color, it affects this. I'm just going to set up a basic scene in cycles. Again, HDRI is not really in the spirit, I guess, of a Nodevember, but whatever. It's just lighting. Okay, so now we have this nicely lit, and I'm thinking for the material, let's just make it nice and metallic and low roughness. And I'm seeing there's a bit of a setting here, so let's run a shade smooth on this. There we go. That looks nice, actually. I'm going to bring down the roughness, and now we have a compressed can. Something interesting is if you want to map a texture, or again these eye sockets and all this, like a checker texture, you're going to notice that it kind of works, the deformation. I guess it's using position coordinates right now. What we could do is we could send over a coordinate system just in case we wanted it. So we could do a store named attribute. I'm going to call this coordinates. So this is before the deformation, so that it works with the deformation. We are going to cast the position. Let's make that a vector. We're going to send over the position, call it coordinates. We can make an attribute, call it coordinates. I'm just sending information into the shader editor. And now you can see we have a coordinate system that compresses with the can. So if I use this as our vector, it looks a bit sloppy, but you can see that it's actually mapping with it. The point of this is, I guess two things. One, I'm going to start off with a wave texture just to add a bit of detail. So if we use a wave texture and set this to Z, we have these nice stripes, which I'm going to distort, make more of them. So I'm just going to add some scratches to the can, some detail, some roughness. This can be used as a bump map. So what I'm thinking is, we can have nice spots on the top too. And the rim is more scratched up, which makes sense. We use this as the height factor for a bump node for the normal. So now you can see our can looks much more scratched up. Bring that down to 10%, and now this looks much more kind of realistic, I think. Let's add more stripes. So this, it's a bit subtle, but this is the before and the after. It just adds a bit of detail to this, and it works with the deformation. For the eye sockets, I basically said, let's make 1 point here and 1 point here and evaluate the distance of our shader points from that. So what I mean by this is where we definitely need to use our custom coordinate system. I want to calculate the distance. So let's think about this. We use our coordinate system. We calculate the distance from this point right here is, let's say, 1.5 units up on the z-axis, a unit forwards on the x-axis. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, and then we shift that a little on the y, bring it up. So we're calculating this radial gradient from here, and this should, yes, it compresses with the can is kind of the point. It like maps with it. So if you take this, you set it to a greater than to evaluate where the radius is or isn't greater. You do that, you do another one of these again, this time offsetting it to the absolute value on the y-axis. Now that gives us the other eye. You take both of these, you combine them using a maximum, a minimum, whatever. Let's actually make these further apart. Maybe minus 0.4 to 0.4. You take these and you make this the alpha socket is the trick. Alpha means transparency. So it's going to actually make this transparent, which looks like we're cutting holes in this even though we're not. And that's how I made my character, which compresses. We can actually also change the eye size pretty easily by making a parameter for these greater than. So I'm going to have my eyes be this big. And now we have a nice can compressing, which is pretty cool. So I think that's the essence of the tutorial. To make them dance, you set up a scene and all this. But thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something about this Nodevember. And tomorrow is Psychedelic, which I still need to figure out what I'm going to do for. Other than that, as always, you can get the blend file in the link in the description for the Patreon. All blend files for the last 3 years have been uploaded there. Thank you to the generous patrons who support this channel. If you want to support what I do here with free tutorials, especially with Nodevember, Patreon is the place to go. Even $1 helps. And I'll also put a Gumroad link. Other than that, that is the show. Thanks for watching.